Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Dr. Sujata Swaroop. I am a licensed psychologist, and I'm also the program coordinator from Project REACH in Boston. We're an organization that provides direct services to survivors of trafficking, including evaluation and brief intervention. We also provide trainings, consultation, and technical assistance to interdisciplinary service providers working across the nation with trafficking survivors. Today, I'm going to be talking for the next 2 hours on trafficking and psychological trauma, identifying best practices from the lens of the service provider. I'm aware that many of the service providers participating in today's webinar have already developed an awareness of the impact of trauma. This presentation, therefore, assumes knowledge in identifying and responding to PTSD reactions. We're going to instead get into conceptualizing what survivors of CSEC and trafficking from a complex trauma perspective and plan for effective trauma-informed ways to respond and engage the survivor. I'm going to focus this presentation from the lens of the service provider, including advocates, rep service providers, therapists, and case managers. So during this presentation, I'm going to present an overview of complex trauma, including conceptualizing ways in which chronic victimization experiences affect and are affected by attachment, regulation, culture, and self-identity. Here I'll use a case example to contextualize how layers of trauma exposure, including neglect, sexual and physical and emotional abuse, can lead to complex trauma reactions. Based on this understanding, we will go on to identify best practices with respect to responding to survivors of CSEC and trafficking. This discussion will look at ways to respond from a trauma-informed lens, emphasizing the need for a trauma-informed approach across broader networks of care. So what is trauma? Macy defines trauma as overwhelming demands placed on the physiological system that result in a profound sense of vulnerability and loss of control. What's important to emphasize here is that trauma is not necessarily about a specific event itself. It's about any overwhelming experience that taxes an individual's ability to cope and results in a felt sense of vulnerability or loss of control. So when we say a person is impacted by trauma, what are we saying? What do we mean? Today we're going to look at some of the ways in which victim survivors are affected by trauma. There's several systems that we're going to be thinking about, including the relational, biological and physiological, neurological and neuropsychological, affective, and information processing and meaning-making systems. Each of these systems is also impacted differently depending on if you're talking about in the immediacy after an acute trauma or long-term after several layers or chronicity of trauma exposures. We're going to break this down and think about it from larger divisions of attachment, including relational, affective, and meaning-making, regulation, including biological, physiological, and neurological, and the individual cultural context, which includes meaning-making, self-identity, and sense of self. I'd like to proceed by grounding what we're talking about today in real life. So I've put together a compilation of victim survivors' experiences and stories into one combined case example. I believe that using a life story and lived experience helps us really understand what we're talking about, both in terms of underpinnings, such as relational attachment, neurological, and self and cultural identity, as well as in terms of trauma-informed response. So I'm going to take a couple minutes to introduce Rosa, and we'll be coming back to Rosa throughout the day. So Rosa is a United States citizen. She was born in New York, and from her early ages, she was exposed to emotional abuse and physical abuse inside the home from her mother, who was a single working mother. She described her relationship with her mother as the home a place where she was yelled at more than talked to, and she described knowing from an early age that she didn't feel safe talking with her mother about any feelings of being unsafe or vulnerable. She also described that beginning around the age of 2 or 3, she recalled instances of sexual abuse by an uncle who was a very, very close family friend and relative. She described not being able to talk with her mother about this sexual abuse because she was afraid that her mother would respond with more physical abuse for discipline. Between the ages of 6 and 10, Rosa was sent to be cared for after school by a babysitter and the babysitter's family, as her mother had to take on additional shifts and work. Within this caregiving context at the babysitter's home, Rosa experienced additional physical, emotional, and verbal abuse at the hands of the babysitter, as well as sexual abuse by the babysitter's husband, and physical neglect in this home in general. By the ages of 9 to 16, this abuse had transferred over to the school, where she experienced a significant amount of school bullying. She began being truant from school and running away from home, as well as her babysitter's house, because she described she didn't feel safe in any of these settings. Because of her truancy, she was placed in group homes, where she felt that she was again exposed to continued bullying and additional rape. She began again running away and living on the streets, and at the age of 17, she engaged in her first romantic relationship, which she described as very confusing because she felt that her boyfriend really loved her, but he could also be significantly physically abusive. Following a very significant instance of physical abuse, Rosa ran away and ran back to the street, where she was targeted by her first trafficker, who I'll name Miguel. Miguel approached Rosa in the form of a boyfriend and told her that he was in love with her and that he wanted to start a different type of life with her. She moved in with him, and then he began trafficking her sexually. After less than a year with him, he sold her to a second trafficker who was extremely physically abusive. And in order to escape the second trafficker, she ran away with a gang who, again, forced her to engage in commercial sexual exploitation and forced her to engage in some other illicit activities that they were involved in. So this was a very lengthy case example, but I want to have a background as context for the rest of the day that we can draw back on. So let's think about the relational system, the attachment and organizing relationships. Our early attachment relationships are the place we learn about ourselves, our emotions, and our relationships with other people. When there are disturbed attachment relationships, including abuse, neglect, or other forms of trauma, all of that, our self-identity, how we manage our emotions, how we view ourselves in relationships, can get impacted. If you've ever seen the still face experiment, you know what happens when a child is not properly mirrored or attended to by its caregiver. In the still face experiment, we see a video where a very young child, is playing on the lap of its mother. It's sitting on her lap, he's babbling, talking to her, showing her his toys, and she's mirroring him. He's clearly very engaged and enthralled with her responses. After a short time, the mother is instructed by the experimenter to freeze her face. When the child sees his mother freeze her face, he does everything he can think of to get her back. He calls to her, he shows her more toys, he shrieks playfully, and without getting a response, he starts to shut down and whimper and clearly be in distress. Eventually, she unfreezes, as indicated by the experimenter. You can see immediately that the child is relieved, and he begins to engage again with his mother once she prompts him to. Now imagine this situation amplified over the long term. Imagine perhaps an emotionally unavailable caregiver, a caregiver who's substance abusing or preoccupied with their own trauma history or current traumatic events. Imagine a home where there is physical, sexual, or verbal abuse, and think about how that can impact the self, one's emotional experience, and the relationships that we seek. So let's think of Rosa. Given her early caregiver and school-age experiences, and reaching into her adolescence, what might be she learning about who she is and what she can expect in the world or from her relationships? These dimensions, such as safety, responsiveness, accuracy, they're all on a continuum. So let's take, for example, predictability and responsiveness. If I cry, I wonder, will mom or dad come feed me? Will my caregiver come change me, hold me? Later, as I grow, I wonder if I fall and run to my caregiver, will she pick me up and tell me I'm okay? Or, in the instance of Rosa, will she blame me, shame me, and tell me it's my fault? In terms of accuracy and sensitivity, we know that children who grew up in households with domestic violence, or around parents with substance abuse, or other dangerous situations, that these children can be very sensitive to identifying anger. They identify it more quickly than peers, and over time, they may interpret a reaction as anger when it's not even there. This manifests as a broken radar, per se, in relationships, and attunement is generally off. And let's take a third example, the example of boundaries. Here, children may develop boundaries that are porous or rigid. The individual, over time, may attach to anyone equally without any need of being proven that they're trustworthy, which is just as dangerous or unsafe as attaching to no one at all. Further, an individual may flip-flop between the two. Think about how this translates to relational interactions later in life, such as sitting with you and how it might feel for you to sit with a client who's had these experiences. In fact, we learn so much from our early relationships, and it truly impacts how we engage with the world. So let's go back to Rosa. She internalized the message, I'm lower than trash, the world is unsafe, and I have no control. She also shared, I need relationships, but relationships are the places I get hurt. Think about the effects these may have for her in the following domains. For instance, her sense of fear or comfort, her ability for self-soothing or tolerance for arousal, her sense of worthiness, how she felt with regard to the safety of emotional and behavioral expression. Think about how this may have left her vulnerable to being targeted for domestic minor sex trafficking. Let's also think about relational dynamics that get reinforced during CSEC and trafficking. We've already talked about how resource-poor early caregiving relationships may leave a child vulnerable to being targeted. Let's think about what happens relationally after being targeted. This is a little bit different than the 101 trauma that we've had before. I'm going to frame this in a way that's relevant to CSEC and human trafficking victims. So think about Rosa, her experience of her traffickers, the first perpetrator who was a boyfriend role, the second perpetrator she was quote-unquote sold to or quote-unquote belonged to because of her boyfriend. And the third group of perpetrators or traffickers were a group that she engaged with seeking protection from her second trafficker. We're going to think about how the quality of those relationships held her captive in her trafficking experiences. We're also going to think about how the quality of these relationships led to exacerbated complex reactions for her later in life. So in thinking about transnational versus domestic trafficking, foreign national victims are often targeted while trying to improve their life in some physical way. There is most often a history of needs being under-resourced in physical or material ways. When this is the case, though of course it's not always, victim survivors are often seen as more amenable to engaging in services once a connection is built with providers. Typically, domestic victim survivors come across as much more rejecting of services from providers trying to help them. This actually translates into one of the biggest struggles in working with survivors of DMST. These victims can be very hard to engage. Most often, they are escaping from abusive home environments, and while basic needs may be lacking, the need for love or affection was the most prominent. Traffickers are often able to find ways to fill that void in confusing ways, for instance, taking on the role of an abusive boyfriend. And it leaves the victim survivor with difficulties of identifying as a victim of C-sex or trafficking. And it leaves them with conflicting loyalties and trust issues, among other concerns. So how do traffickers in domestic cases create this very strong traumatic bond with the victim? It's often similar to what we see in domestic violence, where the perpetrator alternates kindness with abusive actions. Although, in trafficking and CSEC cases, there's the overlay of exploitation and financial gain. But something like this is what we see in traffickers as well. They can be very kind and engaging, and then quickly become abusive, and continue to vacillate back and forth. It creates an attachment that is very difficult to break. The victim survivor often doesn't see their boyfriend, caregiver, or boss as a trafficker, and therefore they do not self-identify as a victim or survivor. For example, there's someone I'll name Angela, a young teenager whose parents had substance abuse issues and domestic violence in the home. She had no solid relationship with her caregivers. In junior high, she was most worried about fitting in among her friends, being seen, and not being beat up at school. She described this as being cool enough to have friends and have a boyfriend. One day when she was at the mall with a group of peers, an older man briefly reached out to her with kindness and attention and offered her his number. The interaction must have been less than 3 minutes. She later called him, and he asked her a lot of questions, like what bands she liked, and he demonstrated an interest in her desire to be a musician. A few phone calls later, he casually dropped that he knew people in the music industry. Over a short amount of time, the relationship between them developed, and she ran away with him. He lured her into sex trafficking, but she didn't see herself as a victim. And despite his quick shift about having to work the streets in the meantime, she was strongly allied with him against the rest of the world and against any service providers. So according to literature, typically as children, victim survivors of DMST were runaways. They may have had deprivation of physical or financial needs, but even more likely they experienced emotional deprivation, like Angela or like Rosa. And so they're seeking out relationships that they couldn't find at home. Unfortunately, once these individuals make it outside the home, terrible things continue to happen to them. Research on runaway youth indicates that youth on the streets are intercepted by some type of perpetrator, often within 24 hours. Yet the relationship with the trafficker was developed to fill an emotional need. The trafficker, while exploitative and likely abusive, also voluntarily fulfilled the deprivation that the victim experienced at home or on the street. That becomes the powerful bond. Again, be thinking here about the relational layers, the trauma history or under-resourced history that leads to the increased chance of being targeted for further victimization. These layers lead to complex trauma reactions that transcend PTSD symptoms, and we have to be thinking about all of this in our framework of response. So we've heard of Stockholm Syndrome, but trauma bonding is a little different. With Stockholm Syndrome, the victim initially identifies as the victim, and that changes over time. But in trauma bonding, the victim never initially identified as a victim. The trafficker had fulfilled an emotional need, and perhaps physical needs as well, at a time when the person was most in need. After being targeted, the trafficker often uses the relationship to control the victim. For instance, with Rosa, her boyfriend used the love that she had for him to coerce her into commercial sexual exploitation to fund his own drug addiction. In the literature, Graham described trauma bonding. He described that due to the threat of a victim's physical or psychological survival, the victim looks for nurturance and protection. Since the victim is isolated, they perceive little things as acts of kindness, and therefore become hopeful that the abuser will allow him or her to survive. This allows the victim to repress feelings such as anger or rage and help them form a positive bond with their abuser. The victim intensifies every small act of kindness so that they are convinced that the abuser really does care about them. Therefore, it becomes the victim's mission to help the abuser remain happy and care for the abuser. Rosa said things very similar to this. She indicated that she believed she could control the extent of physical abuse perpetrated against her by her boyfriend if she just kept him happy at all times. She knew ways to keep him happy and was able to do that. At times, she also did not believe that she could find or perhaps deserve anything better than the relationship she had with him. So this translates to the fact that abusers' feelings and perceptions become the victim's first priority. In order for the victim to accomplish this, they must get inside the head of the abuser, which leads the victim adopting the abuser's feelings and perceptions. With this new mindset, the victim starts to see the police, relatives, and government as the bad guys. The victim may also take out their repressed anger onto these bad guys. And if the conditions last for a significant amount of time, the victim may eventually lose their sense of self and develop a sense of self based on how they are seen from their abuser's eyes. So given that, how can these relationship dynamics and trauma bonding, on top of multiple layers of earlier relational trauma or neglect, impact the trafficking process? Think about exit and re-entry based on a person's lived experience and perception of self, other, and world. Relationship patterns that were previously established, including how one sees oneself and their self-worth, what a person thinks that they can expect or deserve in relationship, changes over time with trauma, as do methods of coping in order to survive a trauma. Coping methods such as substance abuse or self-injury may be adopted. These new relational patterns and coping mechanisms increase the likelihood of ongoing or continuing trauma. This can be seen in Rosa, who was re-trafficked a few more times before getting out. Additionally, we must keep in mind that escape from a trafficking situation does not necessarily mean escape from all danger. Often survivors remain vulnerable given low resources or access to care. By the time they are discovered by law enforcement officials, victims often have experienced multiple chronic traumatizations and may still be experiencing trauma, so not necessarily in the, quote, post-traumatic, end quote, state. So in summary of relationships, be thinking about things that might come up. In the context of polyvictimization and chronic trauma, alterations in relationships tend to occur. The person's sense of self, other, and world gets shifted, and relationships hold a mirror to that shift. Think about Rosa, who had impaired trust, difficulty with boundaries, broken radar, and difficult relationships later with professionals. Think about your own clients. What do you notice about how their relationship with you feels? Does it fluctuate? What might the rapport building phases reflect for this person's internal working model or internal system? How might they understand themselves, the other, and the world? And how is that playing out in their relationship with you? Next, we're going to get into the physiological and neurobiological underpinnings of trauma. This includes discussion on bottom-up development of the brain, role of experience in neurodevelopment, trauma exposure and development, threat response and self-regulation, and the impact on higher order brain functioning and coping. So starting with the brain. The human brain is an amazing and complex organ. It allows us to think, act, feel, laugh, speak, create, and love. The brain mediates all of the qualities of humanity, good and bad. Yet the core mission of the brain is to sense, perceive, process, store, and act on information from the external and internal environment in order to promote survival. In order to do this, the brain has evolved into an efficient and logical organization structure. The brain has bottom-up organization, with the bottom regions, including the brainstem and midbrain, controlling the most simple functions, such as respiration, heart rate, and blood pressure regulation, while the top areas, including the limbic system and the cortex, control more complex functions, such as thinking and regulating emotions. At birth, the human brain is undeveloped. Not all of the brain's areas are organized and fully functional. It is during childhood that the brain matures and the whole set of brain-related capabilities develop in a sequential fashion. We crawl before we walk. We babble before we talk. The development of the brain during infancy and childhood follows a bottom-up structure. The most regulatory bottom regions of the brain develop first, followed in sequence by adjacent but higher, more complex regions. The process of sequential development of the brain, and of course, the sequential development of function, is guided by experience. This is incredibly important. The brain develops and modifies itself in response to experience. So neurons and neuronal connections change in an activity-dependent fashion. This use-dependent development is the key to understanding the impact of neglect and trauma on children. So the brain develops by forming connections. Even though a baby is born with 100 billion brain cells, the connections between these cells form over time. These connections, called neural pathways, are like the wiring in a house or highways that connect one part of the brain to the other. Experience, and usually interactions with one's caregivers, determine the growth and pattern of brain development, including the connections that form the basis for thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. It is through relationships with early caregivers that children develop the brain connections that make it possible for them to trust or mistrust, regulate their own emotions, and love other people. So think about relating this back to what happens if there's no mirror, or if the caregiver was someone like Rosa's. The more a neural system is activated, the more it will build in this neural state. What occurs in this process is the creation of a sort of internal representation of the experience corresponding to the neural activation. This is use-dependent, and this use-dependent capacity makes an internal representation of the external or internal world. This is the basis of learning and memory. We're going to be talking about several topics, ranging from the impact of trauma on biological systems, namely the ways that exposure to trauma affects the brain development and other biological symptoms, including what we know from research on the brain structure and function, as well as the overall nervous system. What I want to highlight up front is that brain plasticity, or the brain's ability to change and form new connections, happens in response to both positive and negative environmental influences. So while this means that childhood trauma can negatively impact brain and body, we also know that interventions can have an impact in this regard and lead to positive outcomes. This is something we need to hold throughout today's session. These two graphs are showing the increases and decreases in brain white and gray matter over the lifespan. What you should note is that gray matter decreases across the lifespan, most rapidly across childhood and adolescence. This is showing that gray matter in the brain dies off due to atrophy over time due to environmental influence, such as areas of the brain that are not stimulated. These die off. In contrast, brain white matter increases from childhood through middle age, showing that brain pathways continue to develop well into adulthood. The brain becomes more and more efficient. You'll notice that the white matter starts to decrease right around retirement age. So let's think about traumatic experience and development. And again, as I talk about this, relate this back to what you know about ROSA. With optimal experiences, or good enough experiences, the brain develops a healthy, flexible, and diverse capabilities. When there is a disruption of timing, intensity, quality, or quantity of normal developmental experiences, however, there may be devastating impact on neurodevelopment, and thereby function. For millions of abused and neglected children, the nature of their experiences adversely influences the development of their brains. During the traumatic experience, these children's brains are in a state of fear-related activation. This activation of key neural systems in the brain leads to adaptive changes in emotional, behavioral, and cognitive functioning to promote survival. Yet persisting or chronic activation of this adaptive fear response can result in the maladaptive persistence of a fear state. This activation causes hypervigilance, increased muscle tone, a focus on threat-related cues, which are typically picked up non-verbally, anxiety, and behavioral impulsivity, all of which are very adaptive during a threatening event, yet clearly become maladaptive when the imminent threat has passed and they remain in place. So let's tie this in with self-regulation. And thinking about the impact on executive functioning, be thinking about what it feels like to sit in the room with one of your more difficult clients or survivors. See if any of this sounds familiar. It's important to ground our understanding of a victim survivor's reactions within a trauma-informed lens. So I'm going to take an everyday example and a brain that's developed under good enough circumstances. This is a representation of an individual's information processing network, or circuit. So I'll give the example, if I get an email from someone that's rude, or if the email makes me mad, I'll take in that information, try to figure out what's going on, thinking about perhaps, is this person really being rude, or am I just sleep deprived today? I'll next think about how I'm going to respond. Maybe I'll wait to write my response until I've cooled off, or maybe I'll have a colleague or friend look at my response first before sending it. After all of these steps, I will then respond. This involves self-regulation through many steps, including observation, interpretation, planning, and action. Among trauma-impacted individuals, their brains have learned that they don't have time to evaluate. In order to stay safe, they need to act quickly. This is similar to if you're crossing the street at the wrong time and there's a truck coming at you. You're not going to stop to think about how fast the truck is going. You're not going to stop to wonder, does the driver see me? You're just going to get out of the way. This response is adaptive in that it promotes in-the-moment survival. It's important to think about the fact, though, that here, the prefrontal cortex and the areas for executive functioning are taken offline. Instead, the limbic system is in gear, and the person is acting a very reactive rather than reflective state. Yet over time, with chronic victimization, a new pathway gets established as the major or primary response network neurologically. Think back to ROSA. When threat is detected by the nervous system, the sympathetic division is activated, leading to a mobilization of fight, flight, freeze, or submit. This is similar to what we saw in ROSA over time later in life. When she sat with me or was interviewed by law enforcement, she felt she was in danger and reacted accordingly. With chronic trauma or polyvictimization, danger signals become generalized, so that even neutral environmental cues, if they have some association with a traumatic event, are responded to as if they're dangerous. Due to the interpersonal nature of trauma, oftentimes danger cues are specific to relationships. So a person might interpret anger where there is none, react to neutral social cues as hostile, and so on. Again, we need this understanding for the second half of this webinar. But later in this webinar, we're going to look at how we might best respond when the victim survivor is quote-unquote reacting. So this slide is a pictorial representation of what I've just talked about for those who respond better to a visual cue than to hearing about it. In non-trauma impacted individuals, we use our executive functioning to use abilities such as planning, inhibiting, and regulating. However, with exposure to chronic trauma, layers of trauma that happen throughout developmental periods, often a person is left in a very dysregulated state. They're either hyper-aroused most of the time, hypo-aroused most of the time, or fluctuate back and forth between the two, but very rarely remain in their window of tolerance. Because they're outside of this window of tolerance, behaviors manifest that help somebody cope. What can coping look like? This leads to key issues that we confront day to day. Understanding that the psychological effects of polyvictimization and complex trauma seen in CSEC and trafficking victim survivors can lead to dysregulation. We might see reactions that we consider difficult or resistant. For example, victims often running away from services and possibly running back to their perpetrator. Another example is frequent drug abuse. Survivors who need stabilization, who need an established network of care, who need us to be thinking about their hierarchy of needs before moving on to building trust. There's also the example of an adolescent who takes on very difficult attitudes with her providers. Someone who might think, I know more than all of you in this room. We need to be mindful that this is a shield for survival and safety, rather than looking at a troubled or defiant individual. This is very similar to Rosa, who kept running away from any services that were put in place for her. These coping behaviors that are listed on this slide all relate to difficulties in regulation. And these difficulties in regulation are known as complex trauma reactions, such as problems regulating emotions, problems with dissociation, somatic reactions, alterations in how someone sees themselves, so someone's identity filled with shame or guilt, or someone who might have poor boundaries and experience difficulty determining who and when to trust. We'll get into what to do about this and how to respond in a moment. Lastly, and this is an area that I'm not going to spend too much time on because I believe that most of the professionals on this webinar have had exposure to, but I want to at least name the importance of self-identity and culture, and understanding that while neurological and relational concepts are very important to keep in mind, how a trauma is experienced and expressed will vary from person to person based on their culture and based on their context. So the first piece of this is trauma and identity. With both acute and chronic trauma, there can be an internalization of negative experience. This leads to a change in how we perceive ourselves. What might have been previously agentic, positive, or neutral may become perceived as damaged in some way, at fault, shameful, or bad. There can also be a fragmentation of experience, leading to state-dependent self-concept rather than a cohesive sense of self. And this can contribute to a lack of exploration. Someone might be taken up with surviving the here and now, moment to moment, and react to the moment to moment rather than engage in long-term planning. It may impact how someone sees the world, might see the world as unsafe or dangerous, and how someone sees relationships, again, as this relationship is as good as it gets, or all that I deserve. So what gets affected? What gets impacted includes self-identity, meaning-making of the world, our perception and meaning-making of experiences in general, and of course, executive functioning and regulation capacities. We see that both internal reflection and meaning-making and external reflection and goal-directed behavior are impacted by trauma. The other point that I really want to stress is the cultural context. We agree in the field that the basic physiological response is essentially culturally invariant. that across the globe, when confronted with an acute trauma, we might flight, fight, freeze, or submit. However, outside of this physiological response, everything else outside of that varies according to the individual or the cultural frame. So how an event is interpreted, how someone responds to their trauma, the meaning of someone's symptoms that they hold for themselves, and their pathways to health or healing are going to vary person to person. The importance here is that we really need to understand from this person's personal framework, their experience of trauma, their history of trauma, and what their view of health and healing is. Working with Rosa, for example, we found that she experienced quite a bit of somatic distress. Her experience of trauma included physical reaction, and the way she sought treatment included medical treatment. In understanding the frame, we really need to ask about, show interest in, and build an understanding of each person's experience, understanding, and expression of distress. Only after having this frame can we pull in the necessary resources. By joining the person's individual frame and intervening where they feel it's salient to intervene, we allow for growth and positive outcomes in a very sustainable way, and we begin to build trust and safety in the relationship. So to summarize this entire section on symptoms impacted by trauma, I want to again bring it back to Rosa and consider how her view of herself, others, and the world has been impacted greatly by her early experience of trauma. She's formed an internal working model where she views herself as, I am damaged goods. She experiences low self-esteem and depression. Her view of others she described as, I want to be close to people, but people have always and will always hurt me. I cannot expect anything different. She attributes much of her neutral interactions as having a lot of hostility because she watches out for hostility in relationships. And most of her relationships have a push-pull quality in their nature. She has come to view the world as a dangerous and unsafe place and feels that there's very little she can do to make it safe. She approaches the world with hypervigilance and hopelessness and is often re-victimized. Survivors of chronic trauma often hold similar internal working models. And when they engage with the world from this internal working model, they often feel triggered and dysregulated. We see manifestations of such dysregulation across 6 domains, including affect, degree of consciousness or dissociation, relationships, systems of meaning, self-identity, and somatic symptoms. So with this foundation, we can move on to talking about how we can recognize and respond to individuals from a trauma-informed lens when working with survivors of CSEC and trafficking. I'm going to talk about different complex trauma reactions that we often encounter, and I'm going to talk about working with each of these reactions through different phases of a victim's survivor's recovery. So I'm going to break it down into trial phases, from pre-trial to post-trial. Well, I pair one complex trauma interaction with each trial phase in order to break it down and have some sort of pattern here. I want to raise the issue that all interactions with the victim survivor are very important, and all of these complex trauma reactions can be coming up at any phase. So as we look at each complex trauma reaction, the focus should be on how to respond when someone is reacting. Think about what you might see, how the victim survivor is responding. Think about why this victim survivor may be reacting in this way. This is understanding from a trauma-informed perspective. And from this standpoint, we can think about ways we might respond without using the power associated with our positions. So these again are the 6 domains of complex trauma, and these are the 6 domains that we'll look at for intervention and response. Earlier in the field, we looked only at PTS symptoms. Symptoms of intrusion, including nightmares and flashbacks, symptoms of arousal, such as someone feeling always on guard or hypervigilant, and symptoms of avoidance, avoiding people or places or things that reminded someone of the trauma. We know that these symptoms manifest after a single incident trauma, such as a car accident or natural disaster. These are the fight, flight, freeze, submit reactions that help us survive a trauma encounter. However, we're learning that in the instance of polyvictimization, or multiple types of trauma exposure, such as physical, sexual, verbal abuse, and neglect, and chronic trauma exposure, so exposure through repeated stages of development, trauma reactions can actually look quite more complex. So while the PTS symptom triad of intrusions, avoidance, and arousal may definitely be present, on top of that, there's an overlay of difficulties with regulation across each of these domains. Survivors of complex trauma commonly present with regulation difficulties, and this tendency for dysregulation is evidenced in alterations in emotional regulation. So for Rosa, this was seen in her hard time with emotions. She'd vacillate with intense anger and then depression and anxiety, and she'd shift quickly between these states, which made it very difficult for herself to know what she needed or was experiencing in the moment, and made it very difficult for providers working with her to know what she might need at the time. The second domain is alterations in consciousness. Rosa had a history of dissociation in which she felt detached from her mental processes or her body. So she would talk about how this started during instances of sexual abuse, where she would look at the point in the wall where the wall met the feeling and the wall met the ceiling and completely disengage from her body altogether. This was very helpful in the moment of surviving a rape, but she began to dissociate more and more even when she wasn't in a traumatic situation, and it became very unhelpful for her. You can think about ways that dissociation might make it difficult for law enforcement or other providers to be working with Rosa throughout the trial phases. So again, we'll talk about intervention in this domain. A third area is alterations in self-perception. For Rosa, this was seen in her frequent feelings of shame and guilt, that she felt not in control most of the time, that she felt powerless or helpless, and then how this impacted her relationships with providers and her engagement in the world around her. Which leads right into the next domain, alterations in relationships with others. So Rosa described often feeling, I don't deserve more than this in a relationship. No one will treat me better. She developed a very difficult relationship with trust, which led to withdrawal and re-victimization. And then the last domain to be watching, the second to last domain, is somatization, which can include chronic pain and headaches that often interfered with service utilization for Rosa. And lastly, alterations in systems of meaning. So here Rosa described a sense of hopelessness, a loss of faith in the future, feeling that the world was unsafe, and feeling that her life was hopeless. So in order to break down each of these complex trauma reactions and think about what they might look like in the context of the trial phases, and to be thinking about how we might respond in a trauma-informed way to support the survivor through these phases, I've developed a handout and a chart. I'm presenting on this handout, but I've made it accessible for free online. So anyone that's interested in downloading this after the webinar, it is at thetraumacenter.org. The website is just TRAUMACENTER.org, and then select the Resources tab. And within Trauma Center Resources, this document is entitled Utilizing Trauma-Informed Approaches for Trafficking-Related Work. I hope this handout can be useful to you following the webinar. So let's take the first core impact area, alteration and regulation of affect and impulses. The core challenge here is managing emotions, behaviors, and physiology, so managing arousal or energy level. What you might see here is the victim survivor in a frozen or shut down state, looking spacey, quickly changing mood or expressions, having a hard time sitting still or being jumpy, perhaps feeling angry and exhibiting hostile behavior, or perhaps presenting as weepy or depressed. And again, it might be fluctuating between these states pretty rapidly. There may be an extreme reactive presentation to other people's statements, and perhaps a misreading of cues and responding strongly. So using the example of the initial encounter phase, I have a brief case example of Lena. Lena is sitting with the lead prosecutor on her case. In reviewing the content of her affidavit, she appears disengaged, as if she's not paying attention. Then she suddenly jumps up and says, "You're not listening to me," and bursts into tears. When the prosecutor tries to speak with her, Lena appears frozen and shut down and fails to respond. So this is tough, right? This feels like a really reactionary, in the moment presentation. And it might feel out of left field, or it might feel purposely difficult. But instead, when we take a step back and recall the impact of trauma on relationships, on regulation, and on identity, we can empower ourselves to respond differently from a different frame. It's important to keep in mind that if a victim survivor appears shut down or disconnected, this may be a sign that the person is feeling overwhelmed. So again, taking the example of the initial encounter phase, for victim service providers and service providers in general, I really want to focus on this question. What is the impact of this phase on victim survivors' emotions? Remember that at this phase, the survivor may be wondering, how do I get my needs met when the world is unsafe? With regard to affect and impulses, the victim survivor may fail to communicate their experience. They may put on a false front, they may isolate, they may substitute powerful emotions for less powerful ones. They may attempt to communicate in ineffective ways, substituting behaviors for verbal communication, or externalizing, or projecting emotions. Thirdly, victim survivors may also over-communicate due to poor relational awareness or an inability to contain intrusive traumatic material. Therefore, your role as a service provider may involve psychoeducation on why it's important to share emotional experience. So you might provide psychoeducation and skills building on identifying, regulating, and expressing emotions and impulses in a safe way. You may also want to focus on thinking with the survivor and how they can communicate their emotional experience. And this may include modeling safe communication yourself, regulating yourself before engaging with a victim survivor, picking your moment to initiate more difficult conversation, balancing with conversation on strengths, the conversations that you have that are difficult, using effective nonverbals such as eye contact, giving physical space, noticing your tone of voice. For example, Rosa vacillated between being very defensive and letting her guard down with her various service providers. This led to a presentation that seemed like she was constantly changing her mind. It was very frustrating for professionals trying to put services into place for her to be working with her, because they put a lot of effort to get her buy-in, and then right as the services were set up, she would decline them. In this case, there is an issue of trust. When Rosa felt triggered because she began trusting her providers more, she pulled back because she had an increase in fear and then defensiveness. It was helpful to see this as a trigger reaction rather than just seeing Rosa as being difficult. When Rosa was triggered, she fell back onto old coping strategies, such as drug use and unhealthy relationships. These coping strategies helped her feel more in control. So providers working with her helped her to recognize when she was feeling triggered. They regulated themselves and because of that, were able to help her regulate. They helped her come up with ideas of what to do, and this increased her sense of support and her capacity to positively self-soothe. Now let's talk about the second core impact area, alterations in relationships with others. Meaning what's impacted is the individual's ability to form safe, trusting relationships with other people. You might see this in vulnerability to ongoing victimization, or for instance, returning to a previously identified trafficker or other abusive situation. You might also see this in an ability to trust others, which might show up as suspiciousness, not regarding the intentions of providers or law enforcement with trust, and making challenging statements. You might see this in terms of pulling back from offered supports or refusing to testify. So using the example of the investigation phase, I'm going to talk about Tamika. Tamika is a 16-year-old girl who has been living with a single foster mother since she was identified as a victim of sex trafficking. The foster mother contacts the police after Tamika has been missing for several days, stating that she has found email messages suggesting that Tamika returned to her pimp and trafficker during the investigation phase. So things to be aware of with this domain include the often confusing nature of victims' relationships with victimizers. We must be conscious of not making assumptions about the victim's perception of these relationships. It's also important to not take it personally if a victim survivor appears distrustful, that we can't expect someone who's been victimized to feel safe or build trust with new people. So the goal here is to provide a safe enough environment that supports the individual's needs and the needs of other service providers such as law enforcement. It may be important to provide opportunities for control and empowerment, such as offering choice about meeting times, where to sit, pacing the interview, and to be aware of safety features in the meeting rooms and the environment in which a victim will be present. Is the area well lit? Is there ready access to an exit? Does the survivor have a choice of sitting with his or her back to the wall versus the door, depending on their preference? The physical environment can support or detract from a sense of safety. So as a service provider, part of your role may be thinking about the greater concept of how trauma shapes a victim's experience of world and other. You may observe the victim survivor's interpersonal functioning, including how does the individual handle one-on-one interactions? How does he or she handle group interactions? What distinctions are there in their interactions across different types of people, such as authority figures versus peers? How does this person handle conflicts with others? You may help other service providers working with the victim survivor, in this case, to expect this relational back and forth, this push and pull, and find ways to work through it. I want to review again the importance of trauma bonding here. That if you look in the literature, persons vulnerable to this type of trafficking most often had relational needs that allowed them to be targeted. Trauma bonding is so prominent in our domestic sex trafficking cases, and it creates a situation where the victim is strongly attached. They're showered with positive attention and gifts for a short span, followed by a considerable amount of time of coercion, deprivation, and violence, possibly consisting of physical, sexual, verbal, or emotional abuse. Therefore, at points, the victim survivor feels like they need this trafficker because they've needed them in the past, and at other times they'll experience intense fear. This back and forth to the trafficker is exactly what one should expect because of this trauma bonding. Bonding with traumatic elements creates a very ambivalent bond. Sometimes a strong attachment and sometimes a strong fear response, and it'll go back and forth between the two. This is what we'd expect, and we expect that working with someone in a later phase will also experience this ambivalence. So help other service providers through this experience. Help them understand not to pull back, get frustrated, or disengage, but to work on developing a trusting relationship. Think about ways to build trust in the relationship given the strong trauma bond. Find ways to tolerate the ambivalence that's coming through and to manage one's own response so that they can be present for the survivor. Recognize that any reactions that are coming up aren't about you and incorporate safety and elements of choice while also setting limits. This will help someone to feel safe. Thirdly, I want to talk about alterations in attention or consciousness. This is difficulty integrating experience into a coherent whole, or disconnecting from experience. Dissociating is a way to manage overwhelming feelings, thoughts, and events. What you might see here is a person appearing disconnected, frozen, or shut down. You might hear about memory gaps, or you might notice slight changes in verbal narratives. So the story might vary from meeting to meeting, which is important during the prosecution preparation phase for trial. Also, not remembering previously remembered details can come up at this time. And presentation might change from meeting to meeting. For instance, someone might come across as very calm and connected one day and present very differently another. You might also notice emotional presentation that does not match the content of the narrative. So someone talking about something that sounds very distressing in nature, but they're very numb or checked out emotionally, or vice versa. So using the example of the prosecution preparation stage, I'm going to talk about Nicole. Nicole is having her third meeting with a police investigator who is gathering evidence related to her case. She has described her experience twice, but this time when asked to give further details, states repeatedly that she does not remember and is unable to confirm detail that she previously reported. Her sentences are disjointed and brief, and she looks spacey with minimal eye contact. So as a service provider, part of your role here will be to support regulation throughout the entire process. You might look for cues for impaired modulation, such as the presence of numbing or avoidance, distraction, isolation, physiological regulation, such as someone needing to be jumping or running or fidgeting. You might notice sexualized behaviors or substance abuse that comes out, or self-harm that indicates someone is having a hard time modulating their internal experience and needs to cope. In these instances, help the survivor identify their internal feeling state and help them self-regulate or engage them in co-regulation techniques. You may also look for evidence specific to dissociative coping, including numbing, avoidance, detachment, forgetfulness, daydreaming or appearing spacey, and reports of feeling unreal or distanced. You might also watch for markedly different behavior or presentations with different people in different situations, noticing some variability across contexts. Again, here, help the person identify their window of tolerance, that area that they feel comfortable. For some survivors, they might only feel comfortable if they're at like a 10 out of 10 scale in terms of busyness and movement, and calming down and moving closer to an 8 or 7 might feel really unsafe in the moment. For others, they might feel closer to a 1 or a 0 and they're very shut down, but perhaps this doesn't feel good and they want help getting to something closer to a 5. Use psychoeducation paired with modulation strategies to help someone learn about their window of tolerance and remain in that window more often than not. Developing skills to get back into it include taking space, breathing, grounding exercises, perhaps planning the rest of one's day, singing, talking about strengths. Have your own repertoire or toolkit in mind of ways to help a client ground and remain regulated. This will be important throughout all phases of the trial. And now I want to shift to the fourth domain, alterations in self-perception. This is ways that experience affects how a person views themselves, and it may include a sense of capability or guilt, responsibility or power and control, and feelings of worth. So what you might see is strong feelings of guilt or shame. You might see someone professing responsibility for something that you don't believe they're responsible for. You might see feelings of helplessness or feeling overwhelmed even by small tasks. Or you might see the minimization of experiences or describing even minor experiences as overwhelming, either of the two. So thinking of the trial phase, I want to be thinking about Michael. Michael, who is a victim of labor trafficking, he incurred charges of drug smuggling across borders during his experience of labor trafficking. He recently came to the attention of the authorities after a fellow victim sought support. During one of his interviews preparing for the trial, he broke down and said, "I'm no good. This is all my fault. I thought I was helping my mom and my family, that if I just did what the traffickers said, they'd let me go, they'd let my brother go. And now I'm just a no-good criminal like them. I should have been able to escape." So here, things to keep in mind and things to help other service providers to keep in mind are to not assume that a statement of felt responsibility is the equivalent of an admission of guilt, that we can support victim survivors in accurate attribution of responsibility, reiterating known facts about the trafficking and its influence on victims' perceptions of responsibility. We can help victim survivors break down tasks concretely into things that they can do little by little, and we might assume that even small tasks might feel overwhelming. We can support victim survivors in accessing help and supports with task completion. For instance, someone who would help them complete forms or make phone calls. And we might focus on the facts of the experiences rather than get caught up in an individual's emotion or lack thereof, or perception of event salience in making determinations on criminality. So in thinking about the trial phase in particular, as a service provider, part of your role here may include working with the survivor on his or her self-narrative and self-identity. So some of the things to focus on may be internal resources or external supports. Internal resources including developing a more positive identity, working on a coherent sense of self over experiences and over time, developing more problem-solving skills and a sense of mastery and competency, developing conflict resolution skills, again, building on that mastery and competency over symptoms, and how that might impact how someone's able to engage in relationships. Helping a victim survivor to be in touch with their values that can assist in goal formation and building a future orientation rather than living in the here and now, focusing on getting that executive functioning back online with the planning and organizing rather than living in the limbic system of the moment-to-moment survival mode. Build in time for play and leisure and the ability to experience joy. All of these things will help build internal resources for the victim survivor. The other side of that coin is making sure that there are ample external supports. So making sure that there's access to support systems of providers, especially if there's not an access to a caregiving system. A great place to start would be with a peer mentor, for example. We should also be building access to community supports and resources, again, to start to build engagement with the world in other and more positive ways, building that connection. This will help in the areas of trust and safety. It'll help with empowerment and control. We also have to be sure to ensure safety in the environment at all times, and to start building any ties to religious, spiritual, or cultural beliefs and expressions. So building the sense of humanity, safety, trust, power, and control is tantamount at this phase and really any phase of the trial. Here, it's also important to help the survivor develop the awareness that feelings may intensify as someone prepares to testify. So therapists might be helpful coming up with coping skills that a person can use while being cross-examined. Therapists may help prepare them to think about safe people to look at during the trial, prepare them for stress reactions that might come up, and help them feel more in control of their bodies during trial. You may have people shut down their feelings during a trial, and that would be problematic because the jury could interpret it as, this person doesn't care about anything that's happening, so why should I care? And the more that a client is empowered to modulate their own distress and stay regulated throughout this process, the more present they're going to be able to be. You want to help them try and feel as present as possible and keep their affect in a place where they're showing what they're feeling so we can see it fully and they're able to participate in the process. So again, going back to that window of tolerance, figuring out where they're most comfortable and how they can stay there. Try to imagine what they might feel like and visualize and anticipate. The challenge at this phase is that you don't necessarily know what you're going to get. You can't anticipate what's going to spike arousal. So sometimes the client might be totally there and cogent and verbal, and another time not. But the important thing is that this means something. It means something triggered them. So the focus is on how to support this person while at the same time managing your own expectations to it and your own reactions around it. So regulation of affect and consciousness, relationship, all of this comes into play here. Lastly, we'll talk about alterations in systems of meaning, or ways that a person's belief system about the world around them is influenced by their experience. For instance, believing in justice, safety, hopefulness, or positive outcomes, impacts of spiritual or religious beliefs. So what you might see at this phase of the trial, and here I'm going to be talking about the post-trial phase, is perhaps dismissing the utility of following through on criminal prosecution, or not believing that anyone can make a difference or help him or her stay safe. So for example, I'm going to talk about Olga. Olga was a victim of sex trafficking and a survivor of chronic trauma. She describes chronic feelings of hopelessness and helplessness. She is unable to follow through with recommendations and strategies suggested by her providers due to the belief that nothing will ever change. She also describes having felt disconnected from her religious community since her relocation to the United States. She notes that even small efforts feel impossible on her own. Her providers begin to feel frustrated with Olga as she's not able to comply with the majority of their recommendations. Her providers are beginning to feel that they are putting more effort into the case than Olga is able to match. So some things to be keeping in mind here are that we can hold the belief in positive outcomes for the victim survivor, while also reflecting understanding of their described viewpoint. It's important to meet the victim survivor where they're at, while also acknowledging possibilities for alternate outcomes. If they dismiss the utility in this, please don't feel like it's something about you versus their belief in the possibility for justice for themselves. Also, if spirituality or religiosity is a source of support for the survivor, work with a trauma-informed religious community that matches the belief system of the survivor. Look to connect them with any resources across spiritual and religious backgrounds. So here, at this phase for post-trial, service providers may center on, what is it like for a victim witness after trial? What supports do they need? It's also important to be thinking about yourself and other service providers you're engaged with. What is the emotional impact for each of us once the role of a professional is over? This is a time to be thinking about the long-term effects of the trial process as well. With regard to systems of meaning, we come back to those trauma-informed self-identity questions that we touched on earlier. The who am I? How do I make meaning of the world around me? How do I understand my experiences? How can I act in the world in an effective manner? We focus on active decision-making and the basic awareness of choice at this stage. Also here, it's important to focus on the ability to modulate attention and arousal again, the awareness of internal states, the modulation of internal states, and mindful attention. Building internal awareness and feelings of competence, for example, feeling competent over symptoms that come up, facilitate reflection and self-curiosity. This allows a person to begin building a more coherent narrative of themselves and other. In this phase, service providers can focus on several things. For instance, in regards to giving a victim impact statement, here a peer mentor or therapist can help a survivor organize their statement, help them think about what they're comfortable sharing, and being with the victim as a support through this process. Some important things to point out are that the survivor is not defined by their statement. Another survivor and advocate, Holly Smith, wrote an open letter to victims who were considering public speaking on their experiences. And she talked about how something like this can really impact a person's sense of self and brought up important points for victims to consider. So something like Holly Smith's open letter can be a resource to use with the client to think about how to facilitate this process as an empowering one rather than re-victimization. Also at this phase, the post-trial, connecting a victim with a victim advocate out of the DA's office is very important, especially if the trafficker is found not guilty or is otherwise out in the community again. Victim advocates can help the survivor be aware of their rights, such as their ability to get a restraining order, and help a survivor lay out steps for a safety plan. So if a trafficker or an intermediate contacts the survivor, they have an idea of what to do, what steps to take, moment by moment. Connection with a therapist at this point may also be helpful if this connection hasn't made earlier. And then thirdly, at this phase, really focusing on the interdisciplinary network of coordinated care is rather important. So having this network of coordinated care work with the victim collaboratively, having every service provider be affirming of choice and power dynamics. Thinking about what it's like for the victim witness after trial is important across this network. This is not the end of the story for them. So to be thinking, what do they need? How do they build a new life? What supports do they need for this? Are there ongoing substance abuse issues? Would parenting classes be helpful? Protection from traffickers in a safe, stable living environment, specialized mental health services, increased social supports, education, employment readiness, all of these supports that could be put in place, especially at this time. The importance here is of sustainable long-term support that's collaborative across networks of care and that's paced. Also, with regard to systems of meaning at this point, it's important that service professionals be thinking about what it's like for them once their role is over. What's the emotional impact on you? Be thinking about things such as vicarious traumatization and self-care. And although I mentioned this at the end, it's important to be thinking about vicarious traumatization and self-care throughout this entire process. Again, be thinking of it in terms of regulation. If we're not regulated in the room sitting with the client, it's almost impossible to expect the client to be regulated. And yet, when a client gets into a dysregulated state, it can be very dysregulating for us. So moment to moment, being aware of what's going in the room and being present to whatever is going on in the room, while also having one foot acknowledging our internal experience and regulating our internal experience so that we can be very present with the victim survivor. Again, I have a couple of slides here on the importance of facilitating these networks. That care cannot be provided to any victim from one domain alone, and that care needs to be multidisciplinary in its nature and coordinated. So in finding the resources that survivors need, it involves effective networking. Be thinking about questions such as who will take the lead in finding the resources? How will the different players in the case interact? How will they work in the most collaborative fashion? And what role do you play as the service provider in making a collaboration work? This slide lists a series of multi-agency responses that may be helpful in attuning to a victim survivor's care. It's important to be thinking about the fact that any number of collaborations can exist. So the importance of communication and collaboration among service providers so that service providers can be working together through the lens of an all-encompassing individualized action plan. Be thinking of, specific to this victim survivor that you're working with, what's important in order to address basic safety needs, basic needs, shelter and housing, mental health services, legal services, substance abuse treatment, educational and planning support, employment planning, skills building, etc. This can't be done by one domain alone, but instead, it's important to tap into trauma-informed networks and make sure that there's trauma-informed approaches across domains. So that brings an end to our presentation today. I hope that this was helpful for everyone. If anyone is interested in having a copy of the slides, please feel free to email me. My email is on this page. It's swaroop@jri.org. I can send you an email copy of the slides. Likewise, if you're having a difficult time finding this handout that I referred to, please let me know. I can provide you with the link to the handout directly. And I hope that this was helpful. Good luck in your work, and I look forward to any type of collaboration in the future. Thank you very much for your time.